August 1956. Boston, Massachusetts. A young woman of 31 stands on a pier in the North End, with two small children clinging to her skirt, and everything she owns in one borrowed suitcase. 3 weeks ago she boarded a great ocean liner in Naples with a husband, a future, and a trunk full of a whole life. The ship went down in the dark Atlantic. Her husband did not come up. Now she stands in a strange country, with no English, no money, and no one, while a clerk tells her there is nothing to be done. Across the pier, a broad-shouldered man in a dark coat watches her hold her children. Nobody recognizes him yet. Here is the story. Her name was Assunta Riccelli. She was 31 years old in the summer of 1956, and 3 weeks before she had been a wife. Assunta was born Assunta Greco in 1925 in a hill village in Calabria, in the south of Italy, where the houses were made of stone, and the families had worked the same poor land for centuries. Her father was a contadino, a small farmer, who grew olives and a little wheat on terraces cut into the mountainside. She grew up in the years of the war, when southern Italy went hungry, when the armies came through, and the village learned what it was to have nothing. She learned young how to make a meal out of bread and oil, and to keep her chin up while doing it. She married Domenico Riccelli in 1948. Domenico was a stonemason, a scalpellino with hands that could shape a block of stone into a windowsill, an arch, an angel for a church. There was no work for a mason in a dying village, and so, like millions of Italians before them, they made the great decision: America. Domenico had a cousin in Boston's North End who would help them get started. They saved for years. They sold everything: the little house, Assunta's mother's gold earrings, the lot, and they booked passage for themselves and their two children, Pietro, who was 6, and little Maria, who was 4. Assunta had a particular thing about her. On the inside of her left wrist, she wore a small, worn medal of Saint Anne. On a thin chain, Saint Anne, the patron of mothers, given to her by her own mother on the dock in Naples. The last thing her mother ever pressed into her hand. In any hard moment, Assunta's right hand would close around that medal at her wrist, and her lips would move in silent prayer. It was the one thing from the old country that the sea did not take, because it was on her body when everything else went down. They sailed in the summer of 1956. In the North End that August, the radios played Dean Martin's "Memories Are Made of This," and the new rock and roll the children loved. Coffee was a dime. The Italian groceries on Hanover Street smelled of basil and fresh bread. But Assunta could not yet hear any of it, because somewhere out on the dark Atlantic, days from America, her ship had collided with another in the fog and the night, and begun to sink. In the chaos, Domenico Riccelli did what a good man does. He got Pietro and Maria into a lifeboat, and Assunta after them, and he went back to help others still trapped below. The ship went down. 40-some souls went with it. Domenico was one of them. He was 33. Assunta was pulled from a lifeboat into a rescue ship with her 2 children, in her nightclothes, and brought the rest of the way to Boston, a widow, penniless. Everything they had owned at the bottom of the ocean, in a country whose language she could not speak. On the morning of August 14, 1956, at 10:30, Assunta sat in a downtown relief office with Pietro and Maria, trying to understand what would become of them. The man across the desk was a caseworker named Howard Tibbett, who did not have an interpreter and did not try very hard to find one. He read from a form, loudly, the way people do when they think volume is the same as understanding. Mrs. Riccelli, You have no sponsor of record now that your husband is deceased. No assets, no employment, no domestic address. Without a sponsor, your status here is irregular. The agency isn't equipped to house a family indefinitely. You may be looking at temporary placement of the children, separately, until your situation is resolved. He pushed a paper at her. Sign here. Do you understand? The children may go somewhere else, for now. Assunta understood enough. She understood the children and separately. Her right hand closed around the little medal at her wrist. There were others in the waiting room, a young Italian man there to translate for his own mother, and an older woman. They heard the loud, cold voice, watched the widow clutch her two babies closer. No, Assunta said, in her few words of English. They are mine. We stay together. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep in front of the strangers. She held Pietro and Maria against her and sat very straight. A woman who had crossed an ocean and buried a husband at sea and would not now be separated from the only thing she had left. Where are you watching from? Drop your state in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. The broad-shouldered man near the pier was Charles Bronson. He was 34 years old that summer, a working actor whose face was just starting to be known. In Boston for a few days of work and staying near the North End, because he liked it there, the narrow streets, the bread, the old country talk that reminded him of something. Because Charlie Buczynski had been an immigrant's son. He was born in a Pennsylvania coal patch, one of 15 children of a Lithuanian father who'd come to America with nothing and gone straight down into the mines. Charlie had grown up in 2 languages and a great deal of hunger. He knew exactly what it was to be a foreign family in America with empty hands, treated as a problem to be filed away. He had watched his own mother hold her chin up in front of cold men. He was having coffee at a cafe on Hanover Street when the young Italian man who'd been at the relief office came in, upset, and told the cafe owner in Italian what he'd just seen. The shipwrecked widow, the 2 babies, the caseworker who wanted to take the children separately. The North End was a village too, in its way. The story went around the cafe in minutes, and Charlie Buczynski, immigrant's son, went very still over his cup. He did not march into the relief office and write a check. A check would not give a proud Calabrian widow a life, and charity from a stranger would have shamed her. So he did it the way the North End itself would do it, through its own. He went to the parish priest at the great Italian church on the hill, Father Capello, and to the head of an old North End family that ran a stonework and monument business, Gennaro Bruno, of Bruno & Sons Monument Works, marble men, the kind of business that always needed skilled hands and always looked after its own. And quietly, with his own money behind it, but his name kept entirely out of it, Bronson arranged 3 things, all of them framed as the community taking care of one of its own. First, a home, a clean 2-room flat on Prince Street, the rent quietly covered through the parish for as long as she needed, presented to Assunta as church charity for a shipwrecked widow. Second, work, a job for Assunta doing the books and the fine hand finishing at Bruno & Sons, because her late husband had been a scalpellino, a stonemason, and she knew stone, knew the lettering, the saints, the work. Honest, skilled, dignified work, where her knowledge of her husband's own trade made her valuable, not pitied. Third, and this is the part that mattered most, he made certain, through a lawyer and the relief office's own superiors, that there would be no talk, ever again, of taking Pietro and Maria separately. A sponsored widow with a home and a job does not lose her children. The cold caseworker's paper went in the trash. Bronson's name appeared on none of it. To Assunta, the parish had found her a flat, and a good Italian family had given her work. And America had turned out to have a heart after all. Have you ever had someone make sure you could keep your children and stand on your own feet at the very moment a stranger told you that you'd lost everything? Even them. That moment changes everything, doesn't it? Charles Bronson never met Assunta Riccelli. He finished his work in Boston, walked the narrow streets of the North End one last evening, past the smell of the bakeries and the old men playing cards, the streets that reminded him of the immigrant world he'd come from. Then he got in his car and drove out toward the rest of his life. He left no word. Father Capello was sworn to keep the donor's name. Gennaro Bruno was told only that a friend who'd known hard times wanted to help a widow keep her children. Assunta believed the church and a good family had saved her. He drove west, the son of immigrants who'd once had nothing, having quietly made sure another immigrant family would not be erased. Assunta Riccelli kept her children. She kept her dignity, and she built a life. She worked at Bruno & Sons Monument Works for 29 years, first on the books, then as the one who hand-lettered the finest memorial inscriptions, the Italian names and dates and saints, in a careful hand her stonemason husband would have known. The Bruno family came to regard her as one of their own. She never remarried. She raised Pietro and Maria in the flat on Prince Street, in the heart of the North End, among her own people. Her English came slowly, then surely. She became, in time, one of the women the newer Italian immigrants came to when they were lost and frightened, and could not understand the cold forms, because she had been there, on that pier, with 2 babies and no words, and someone had not let her drown. She sat with hundreds of new arrivals over the years, at relief offices and clinics and schools, translating, steadying, holding chins up. Her son Pietro grew up and became a builder. He ran a Boston construction firm for 30 years, raising up in steel and concrete the kind of life his stonemason father had crossed an ocean to find. Her daughter Maria became a teacher in the Boston schools, teaching the children of immigrants to read the language her own mother had once been unable to speak. Assunta lived to be 94. She died in 2019, in the North End, surrounded by Pietro and Maria and a great crowd of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. A whole American family descended from a widow who had arrived on a pier with nothing but 2 children and a saint's medal on her wrist. She never knew the name of whoever had truly been behind the flat and the job. She thanked the church and the Brunos all her life. She never imagined a young American actor in a cafe had heard her story and quietly refused to let her sink twice. It is kept today in the family of her son Pietro, in a small glass-fronted cabinet in his home, and a copy of the photograph hangs in the office of Bruno & Sons Monument Works, which still operates in the Boston area. It is the little worn medal of St. Anne on its thin chain, the one thing Assunta carried up out of the Atlantic, the last gift from her own mother on the dock at Naples. It sits now on a folded square of cloth beside a photograph of Assunta at her lettering bench at Bruno & Sons, a chisel and brush in her hand. Tucked behind the photo is a card the Bruno family kept, the original 1956 note that came with the offer of work unsigned, in a lawyer's hand, reading only, "For the stonemason's widow. She knows the work. Let her keep her children. A friend." For decades, the Bruno family assumed a friend was simply a generous parishioner. The truth surfaced the way it does in an old neighborhood, through the stone itself. In recent years, Pietro's grandson, researching the family history and the firm's old records, found that 1956 note in the Bruno files and tried to trace a friend. An old retired North End lawyer, near the end of his life, finally told him the donor had been a young actor, then nobody much, who'd been having coffee on Hanover Street the day the widow's story went around, a man who'd grown up an immigrant son himself and who'd grown up to be Charles Bronson. The family kept it quiet, the way the North End keeps things. They only set that little note behind Assunta's photograph, where it remains. If this story reached you, do me a favor, pass it on. Share it with a veteran in your life. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet. There are more Bronson stories coming. And unfortunately, they don't make men like Charles Bronson anymore.